The black Bentley moved slowly through the crowded streets of London as thousands of people lined the roads, waving flags and holding flowers. Inside the car, Prince William sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap as he watched the sea of faces through the tinted windows. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. Today was different from any other royal event he had attended. Today he would walk into Westminster Abbey not just as a prince, but as someone carrying the hopes and grief of an entire nation. Beside him, his younger brother Harry stared straight ahead, his jaw tight with emotion he was trying hard to control. The two brothers had barely spoken during the journey from Kensington Palace. What was there to say? They both knew what lay ahead. They both understood the eyes of the world would be watching their every move, searching for signs of how they were handling this most difficult day. The driver's voice came through the intercom, soft and respectful. "Your Royal Highnesses, we're approaching Westminster Abbey now." William nodded slightly, straightening his black suit jacket. He could see the ancient towers of the Abbey rising before them, its Gothic spires reaching toward the gray London sky like stone fingers pointing to heaven. As their car turned the final corner, the massive crowd became visible. People had been waiting since dawn, some camping overnight to secure the best viewing spots. Police barriers held back the throngs of mourners, many clutching photographs and flowers. The sound of their voices created a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the car windows. Harry finally broke the silence between them. "Are you ready for this?" he asked his older brother, his voice barely above a whisper. William turned to look at him, seeing his own mixture of sadness and determination reflected in Harry's eyes. "We have to be," William replied simply. "For her." The car slowed to a stop at the designated entrance. Outside, the distinctive red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats of the British Royal Guards came into view. These were the same guards who had stood at attention outside Buckingham Palace, who had been part of the royal family's life for as long as either brother could remember. Today they formed a solemn honor guard, their faces serious beneath their ceremonial headwear. William reached for the door handle, then paused. He thought about all the times he had entered Westminster Abbey before, for happy occasions, for state ceremonies, for celebrations. But never for something like this. Never when his heart felt so heavy and the future seemed so uncertain. The door opened and the sound of the crowd rushed in like a wave. Camera flashes began immediately, creating a strobing light that made the gray morning seem to flicker between brightness and shadow. William stepped out first, his tall frame immediately recognizable to the waiting crowd. A hush fell over the nearest sections of people, as if they understood the solemnity of watching these two young men face such a public moment of private grief. Harry emerged from the car behind his brother, and together they stood for a moment, taking in the sight before them. Westminster Abbey loomed above them, its ancient stones having witnessed centuries of royal history. Kings and queens had been crowned here, married here, and laid to rest here. The building itself seemed to hold the weight of all that history, and today it would hold something more, the grief of two sons saying goodbye to their mother. The royal guards stepped forward in perfect synchronization, their polished boots clicking on the stone pathway. The captain of the guard, his uniform decorated with years of service medals, approached the princes with measured steps. His face was stern but respectful, understanding the gravity of his role in this moment. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said with a crisp salute, his voice carrying the authority of centuries of military tradition. "The guard is honored to escort you into Westminster Abbey." William and Harry nodded in acknowledgement, their training and royal protocol taking over even as their hearts raced with emotion. As they began to walk toward the Abbey's entrance, the crowd's silence was broken by spontaneous applause. It started slowly, just a few people clapping, but it quickly spread through the masses of onlookers. This wasn't the enthusiastic cheering usually heard at royal events. This was something deeper, a recognition of courage, a show of support for two young men facing an impossible situation with dignity. The sound of the applause mixed with the distant toll of church bells across London, creating a soundtrack of both celebration and mourning that seemed to capture exactly how the nation was feeling. William and Harry walked steadily forward, their steps in sync, their faces composed despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. Behind them, their car pulled away quietly, leaving them to face what came next on foot, surrounded by the guards who had sworn to protect the royal family. Ahead of them, the great doors of Westminster Abbey stood open, revealing the soft glow of candlelight within and the silhouettes of the hundreds of people already gathered inside. The moment felt suspended in time, as if the entire world had paused to watch these two brothers take the steps that would carry them into the most difficult hour of their young lives. The heavy wooden doors of Westminster Abbey closed behind them with a soft thud that seemed to separate the princes from the outside world. Inside, the atmosphere was completely different from the bustling crowds and camera flashes they had just left behind. Here, centuries-old stone walls rose toward vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadows above. The air smelled of old wood, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of the flowers that filled every available space. William and Harry paused just inside the entrance, their eyes adjusting to the softer light. Hundreds of candles flickered throughout the abbey, casting dancing shadows on the carved stone pillars and ancient memorials. The silence was almost overwhelming after the noise outside, broken only by the quiet shuffling of feet and the occasional whispered conversation among the gathered mourners. The royal guards who had escorted them took their positions along the walls, becoming living statues in their red uniforms. Their presence was reassuring, a reminder of the traditions and stability that had guided the royal family through both joy and sorrow for generations. The captain of the guard gave a subtle nod to the princes before stepping back, allowing them this moment to gather themselves before continuing deeper into the abbey. Harry looked around at the familiar surroundings, remembering happier times when he and William had visited here with their mother. She had loved showing them the history contained within these walls, pointing out the tombs of kings and queens, explaining the stories behind the stained glass windows that now cast colored patterns across the stone floor. Those memories felt both precious and painful now, like looking at photographs of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. An usher approached them quietly, dressed in formal black with a white collar that marked his position within the abbey's hierarchy. His face showed the careful balance of respect and professionalism that came from years of managing important ceremonies. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, "if you would please follow me." They began to walk down the center aisle, their footsteps echoing softly despite their efforts to move quietly. On either side, the pews were filled with faces William and Harry recognized. Family members, close friends, dignitaries from around the world, and representatives from the many charities and organizations their mother had supported. Each person they passed offered a small nod or a gentle smile, expressions of sympathy that needed no words. As they walked, William found himself remembering the last time he had been in Westminster Abbey for a happy occasion. The contrast was almost too much to bear. Then the same stone walls had echoed with celebration and joy. Now, they seemed to absorb the collective grief of everyone present, holding it within their ancient embrace like a sacred trust. The stained glass windows caught what little sunlight managed to break through the London clouds, creating pools of blue, red, and gold light on the floor. William remembered his mother once telling him that the windows were like prayers made visible, each piece of colored glass representing hopes and dreams offered up to heaven. Today he wondered what prayers the light was carrying. Halfway down the aisle, Harry suddenly stopped walking. William turned to look at his brother, seeing that Harry's composure was beginning to crack. His shoulders were shaking slightly, and his breathing had become quick and shallow. The weight of the moment, the finality of what they were walking toward seemed to hit him all at once. Without hesitation, William stepped closer to his brother, placing a gentle hand on Harry's shoulder. "It's okay," he whispered, his own voice thick with emotion. "We can do this together." The simple gesture was seen by many in the nearby pews, and several people wiped away tears at witnessing this moment of brotherly support. Harry took a deep breath, nodded, and they continued walking. The usher had waited patiently, understanding that grief could not be rushed or forced to follow any schedule. The royal guards remained motionless at their posts, their training allowing them to be both present and invisible when the situation required it. As they moved deeper into the abbey, the full scope of the gathering became clear. Every seat was filled, and people stood along the walls where no seating was available. Representatives from countries around the world had come to pay their respects, showing how far-reaching their mother's influence had been. Aid workers from Africa sat next to European royalty. Hospital workers who had known her charitable visits sat beside government ministers. It was exactly the kind of diverse gathering she would have loved. People from all walks of life united by a common purpose. The altar area came into view, decorated with white flowers and lit by dozens of candles. The archbishop stood waiting, his ceremonial robes a reminder of the solemnity of the occasion. Behind him, the choir stalls were filled with singers whose voices would soon fill the ancient space with music chosen specifically for this day. William and Harry were guided to seats in the front row, where other members of the royal family were already seated. Their father sat nearby, his own grief evident despite his efforts to maintain royal composure. Their grandmother, the Queen, sat with the bearing of someone who had presided over the nation through decades of both triumph and tragedy. Her presence was a steadying force, a reminder that the monarchy would endure even in its darkest hours. As they took their seats, both brothers looked toward the front of the abbey where their mother's casket rested. Covered with flowers and the royal standard, it was draped with white roses, her favorite flowers, and a simple card that read Mummy in William's handwriting. The sight of it made the reality of the situation impossible to deny any longer. The last of the guests were being seated, and soon the ceremony would begin. Outside, the crowds continued to wait in respectful silence, many watching on large screens that had been set up in nearby parks. Inside Westminster Abbey, two young princes sat surrounded by history and tradition, preparing to say goodbye to the woman who had meant everything to them. The first notes of the hymn began to rise from the choir, filling Westminster Abbey with a sound so beautiful and haunting that it seemed to come from heaven itself. William closed his eyes and let the music wash over him. Remembering how his mother had always loved singing, she would hum while cooking breakfast, sing along to the radio in the car, and sometimes even convince him and Harry to join her in impromptu performances in the drawing room at Kensington Palace. The choir's voices soared through the ancient rafters, each note perfectly pitched and timed. These were some of the finest singers in England, chosen specifically for their ability to convey both technical excellence and deep emotion. As they sang, many of the congregation found themselves transported back to their own memories of Diana, each person carrying their own special moments with the woman they had come to honor. Harry opened the order of service in his hands, reading through the carefully chosen readings and hymns. Each selection had been picked to reflect different aspects of his mother's life and beliefs. There were traditional hymns that spoke to her faith, modern songs that reflected her connection to contemporary life, and readings that captured her dedication to helping others. Seeing it all laid out on paper made the scope of her impact feel both overwhelming and inspiring. As the first hymn concluded, the Archbishop stepped forward to the pulpit. His voice carried clearly through the abbey as he began to speak about Diana's life and legacy. He talked about her as a mother, a humanitarian, and a person who had touched millions of lives around the world. William found himself thinking about all the times he had watched his mother interact with people, how she always seemed to know exactly what to say to make someone feel better, how she could make a sick child smile just by holding their hand. The Archbishop's words painted a picture of a woman who was both royal and remarkably human, someone who had used her position to shine light on causes that others might have ignored. He spoke about her work with landmine victims, her visits to hospitals, her dedication to fighting homelessness. With each example, William felt a surge of pride in his mother's accomplishments, mixed with sadness that there would be no more such moments to witness. During a quiet moment between readings, Harry found his mind drifting to a memory from just a few months earlier. He and William had been home from school for the holidays, and their mother had taken them to visit a homeless shelter where she volunteered regularly. Harry remembered being amazed at how naturally she interacted with people who had so little, how she listened to their stories with genuine interest and concern. She had taught them that day that being royal meant serving others, not being served by them. The next reading came from Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, who had traveled from the family estate to be here. His voice shook slightly as he read from the Bible, choosing passages about love, loss, and eternal hope. William watched his uncle struggle with his own emotions and felt a deep appreciation for the courage it took to speak publicly at such a difficult time. It reminded him that grief was something the entire family was sharing, not just him and Harry. As the service continued, William became aware of the sounds coming from outside the abbey. Even through the thick stone walls, he could hear the crowds that had gathered in the streets, Police estimates suggested that over 1 million people had come to London that day, all wanting to be part of this moment in history. The thought of so many people sharing in their family's grief was both comforting and overwhelming. A soloist stepped forward to perform one of Diana's favorite songs, chosen because she had often hummed it while working in her garden at Kensington Palace. The singer's voice was clear and strong, but filled with emotion that made even the royal guard standing at attention blink back tears. William remembered watching his mother tend to her roses, how peaceful she looked when she was surrounded by growing things and natural beauty. During the performance, Harry noticed movement in the congregation. People were wiping their eyes, reaching for tissues, and some were quietly crying. These weren't just polite tears of sympathy. This was real grief from people who had genuinely loved Diana and felt her loss deeply. There were AIDS patients she had comforted, charity workers she had inspired, and ordinary citizens who had felt connected to her because of her warmth and authenticity. The royal guards maintained their positions throughout the service, but William could see that even these highly trained soldiers were affected by the emotion in the room. Their eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but their faces showed the strain of maintaining composure in such circumstances. These men had sworn to protect the royal family, and William realized that their presence here was their way of continuing that protection, even in this moment of greatest vulnerability. As another hymn began, William found himself really listening to the words for the first time. The lyrics spoke about hope beyond sorrow, love that transcends death, and the promise that those we lose are never truly gone from our hearts. He wondered if his mother could somehow hear the music, if she knew how many people had come to celebrate her life and mourn her passing. The Archbishop announced that the next reading would be performed by a representative from one of Diana's favorite charities, an organization that worked with homeless youth. The woman who approached the microphone was someone Diana had worked with closely, and her voice carried the weight of personal loss as well as professional respect. She read a passage about caring for the least fortunate, words that seemed to capture the essence of Diana's approach to her royal duties. As the reading concluded, William looked around the Abbey once more, taking in the faces of all the people who had come to honor his mother. There were world leaders and homeless advocates, celebrities and charity workers, royalty and regular citizens. In death as in life, Diana had brought together people who might never have otherwise shared the same space, united by their respect for a woman who had chosen to use her privilege to help others. The choir began the final hymn of this portion of the service, their voices rising once again toward the vaulted ceiling. William and Harry stood with the rest of the congregation, their voices joining the collective song of farewell and hope that filled every corner of Westminster Abbey. The moment everyone had been waiting for and dreading in equal measure had arrived. Earl Spencer, Diana's younger brother, rose from his seat and walked slowly toward the pulpit. His footsteps echoed in the hushed Abbey as hundreds of eyes followed his movement. William and Harry watched their uncle with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, knowing that he would be speaking not just as a member of the nobility, but as Diana's brother who had known her long before she became a princess. Earl Spencer reached the ornate wooden pulpit and paused for a moment, looking out over the sea of faces before him. The silence in Westminster Abbey was complete. Even the sounds from outside seemed to fade away as everyone waited for his words. He had written his speech carefully, knowing that millions of people around the world would hear what he had to say about his sister. When he began to speak, his voice was clear and steady, but those who knew him well could detect the emotion he was working hard to control. He started by talking about Diana as a child, painting a picture of a girl who was always drawn to helping others, even when they were growing up together at the family estate. He described how she would rescue injured birds, comfort crying playmates, and always stand up for anyone who was being treated unfairly. William found himself smiling slightly at these stories, recognizing the same qualities in his mother that he had witnessed throughout his own childhood. She had been the one to comfort him after nightmares, to celebrate his smallest achievements, and to teach him that true strength came from being kind to others. Hearing his uncle describe these same traits in the young Diana made him feel connected to a version of his mother he had never known but could easily imagine. Earl Spencer's voice grew stronger as he moved into talking about Diana's role as a mother. He spoke about how devoted she was to William and Harry, how she fought to give them as normal a childhood as possible, despite the extraordinary circumstances of their birth. He described her determination to expose them to the real world, taking them to homeless shelters and hospitals not as photo opportunities, but because she wanted them to understand their responsibility to help others. Harry felt tears starting to well up in his eyes as his uncle talked about their mother's fierce protectiveness. Earl Spencer described how Diana would do anything to shield her sons from unnecessary pain or publicity, how she worried constantly about the pressures they faced as young royals. He spoke about her hope that they would be able to make their own choices about their futures, free from the crushing weight of expectation that had sometimes made her own life so difficult. The speech took an unexpected turn as Earl Spencer began to address the media's treatment of his sister. His voice became firmer, more passionate, as he spoke about the relentless pursuit by photographers and reporters that had made Diana's life increasingly difficult in her final years. The words carried a clear message about the price of fame and the responsibility that came with public interest in royal lives. Many in the congregation shifted uncomfortably as Earl Spencer's criticism became more direct. He spoke about the need to protect William and Harry from the same intrusive attention that had plagued their mother. His words were both a plea and a warning, delivered with the authority of someone who had watched his sister struggle with unwanted scrutiny for years. William and Harry exchanged glances, understanding that their uncle was not just eulogizing their mother, but also trying to create a shield around them for the future. They felt both grateful for his protection and aware that this speech would likely be remembered and discussed for years to come. The royal guard standing along the walls remained motionless, but their presence seemed more significant now, a visible reminder of the security that surrounded the royal family. As Earl Spencer moved toward the conclusion of his speech, his tone became more personal again. He spoke directly to William and Harry, acknowledging their loss and expressing his admiration for their courage in facing such a public ordeal. He promised that Diana's family would continue to be part of their lives, ensuring that they would always have people around them who remembered their mother as she truly was, not just as the public had known her. The final words of the eulogy were addressed to Diana herself, a brother's farewell to a sister he clearly loved deeply. Earl Spencer spoke about her unique combination of compassion and determination, her ability to bring joy to others even when she was struggling with her own challenges. He described her as someone who had changed the royal family forever, making it more human and more connected to the people it served. As he concluded and stepped back from the pulpit, the silence in Westminster Abbey was profound. Earl Spencer had spoken truths that many had thought but few had dared to voice so publicly. His words would be analyzed and discussed for decades to come, but in that moment, they simply hung in the air of the ancient church like a prayer and a promise combined. The Archbishop stepped forward again, his role now to guide the service back to its spiritual focus after Earl Spencer's very human and emotional tribute. He began to read from the Bible, choosing passages about eternal love and the hope of reunion in death. His voice was gentle but strong, providing a counterpoint to the raw emotion that had just filled the abbey. William found himself thinking about the complexity of his mother's life as he listened to the Archbishop's words. She had been beloved by millions, criticized by some, protected by her family, and pursued by the media. Through it all, she had tried to be a good mother to him and Harry, while also fulfilling what she saw as her duty to help others. The weight of that responsibility seemed enormous when he thought about it from his current perspective. Harry was still processing his uncle's speech, particularly the parts about protecting him and William from media intrusion. He understood that their lives would never be completely private, but he appreciated having someone speak so forcefully about their right to some degree of normalcy. It made him feel less alone in facing the challenges that lay ahead. The service was moving toward its conclusion, but the impact of Earl Spencer's words would linger long after the final hymn was sung. He had spoken not just as a mourner, but as a guardian, establishing a narrative about Diana's life and death that would influence how history remembered both her and this day. The Archbishop raised his hands above the congregation, and Westminster Abbey fell into complete silence for the final blessing. Every person in the ancient church seemed to hold their breath as the solemn words echoed off the stone walls that had witnessed so many royal ceremonies throughout the centuries. William and Harry stood with their heads bowed, feeling the weight of tradition and grief combining in this most sacred moment. The blessing seemed to stretch on forever, each word carefully chosen to bring comfort to those who mourned and hope to those who felt lost. The Archbishop's voice carried through every corner of the abbey, reaching the royal guards who stood at attention along the walls, their red uniforms a splash of color against the gray stone. Even these highly trained soldiers, accustomed to ceremony and protocol, seemed moved by the solemnity of the moment. As the final words of the blessing faded away, the congregation remained standing in respectful silence. Then slowly the great organ of Westminster Abbey began to play the opening notes of the recessional hymn. The sound was both mournful and triumphant, capturing the complex emotions of a day that honored a life while acknowledging a tremendous loss. The choir joined in with voices that seemed to lift the spirits of everyone present. Even as tears continued to flow down many faces, William found himself thinking about all the times his mother had loved music, how she would turn up the radio while driving and sing along without caring who might see her. She had taught him and Harry that joy could be found even in difficult times, and the beauty of the music seemed like a final gift from her. The time had come for the royal family to process out of the abbey. The Queen rose first, her movements dignified despite her own grief. She had buried many people she loved during her long reign, but this was different. This was the mother of her grandsons, a woman who had brought both joy and challenge to the royal family. Her presence provided stability in a moment when everything else felt uncertain. Prince Charles stood next, his face showing the strain of the day, but also a quiet determination to support his sons through this ordeal. The complicated relationship he had shared with Diana was set aside now in favor of their shared love for William and Harry. Whatever differences had existed between the adults, there was no question about their united commitment to protecting these two young men. William and Harry followed their father and grandmother, walking side by side as they had entered. Their steps were measured and careful, aware that every movement was being watched by the hundreds of people in the abbey and the millions more watching around the world. The royal guards fell into formation around them, their presence both protective and ceremonial. As they moved down the center aisle, many in the congregation reached out with gentle touches or whispered words of comfort. These small gestures of human connection seemed to break through the formal protocol of the moment, reminding everyone that beneath the royal titles were two sons saying goodbye to their mother. A hospital worker Diana had visited touched William's arm softly. A charity volunteer Harry recognized offered him a small nod of support. The flowers that filled the abbey seemed even more beautiful now, their colors more vivid against the ancient stone. These weren't just decorations, they were offerings from people around the world who wanted to express their love for Diana through the universal language of natural beauty. White roses, her favorites, seemed to glow in the candlelight as the royal family passed by. Outside Westminster Abbey, the crowds had been waiting for hours to see this moment. As the great doors began to open, revealing the royal family emerging into the gray London afternoon, a spontaneous wave of applause began to ripple through the thousands of people lining the streets. This wasn't the enthusiastic cheering typical of royal celebrations. It was something deeper and more respectful, an acknowledgement of courage in the face of overwhelming loss. The royal guards who had remained outside maintained their positions as the family emerged, creating a corridor of protection and tradition. Their commander stepped forward to receive the royal family, his crisp salute a reminder that even in grief, the traditions and security of the monarchy continued. The sight of these uniformed men, standing at perfect attention, provided a sense of continuity and stability that many found comforting. William looked up at the crowd for the first time since entering the abbey hours earlier. The sea of faces showed a mixture of sadness, sympathy, and genuine affection that surprised him with its intensity. These weren't just curious onlookers. These were people who felt they had lost someone important to them personally. Many held photographs of Diana, flowers, and handmade signs expressing their love and support. The weather had remained overcast throughout the day, but as the royal family stood on the steps of Westminster Abbey, thin shafts of sunlight began to break through the clouds. Some in the crowd took this as a sign, a final blessing on a day that had been marked by both sorrow and celebration of a life well lived. The light caught the stained glass windows of the abbey, sending colored reflections across the stone steps where the family stood. Harry found himself overwhelmed by the support visible in the crowd. He had known that people loved his mother, but seeing the evidence of it stretching as far as his eyes could see made her impact feel both more real and more impossible to fully comprehend. These were people from all walks of life who had taken time from their own lives to honor hers, and their presence provided comfort he hadn't expected to feel. The moment on the Abbey steps seemed suspended in time, a pause between the formal ceremony inside and whatever came next. The royal guards waited patiently for their signal to begin the procession that would take the royal family to their cars and eventually to the more private burial that would follow. But for now, they all stood together in the afternoon light, surrounded by the love and support of a nation that was saying goodbye to someone they would never forget. The archbishop appeared in the doorway behind them, his ceremonial robes flowing in the slight breeze that had picked up. His presence marked the official end of the public service, though the private grief of the family would continue long after the crowds dispersed and the cameras stopped recording. The procession began to move away from Westminster Abbey, but the impact of what had just taken place would resonate far beyond this single day. William and Harry walked between their father and grandfather, surrounded by the royal guards whose red uniforms had become a symbol of protection and continuity throughout the ceremony. As they moved toward their waiting cars, both brothers carried with them not just the memory of their mother's funeral, but the beginning of understanding about their own roles in continuing her legacy. The crowds lining the streets remained respectfully quiet as the royal family passed, but their faces told stories of personal connection to Diana that went far beyond normal royal protocol. There were nurses who remembered her hospital visits, teachers whose schools she had supported, and countless ordinary people who had felt inspired by her example to help others in their own communities. The sight of so many people united in grief and respect created a powerful reminder of the positive impact one person could have on the world. As William settled into the car for the journey to the private burial, he found himself thinking about the promises his uncle had made during the eulogy. Earl Spencer's words about protecting him and Harry from unwanted intrusion felt both comforting and challenging. William understood that his future would involve balancing his desire for privacy with his duty to serve the public, just as his mother had struggled to do throughout her royal life. The royal guards who had stood watch throughout the ceremony were now organizing the security for the next phase of the day's events. Their precision and dedication provided a sense of stability that both princes found reassuring. These men represented centuries of tradition and service, and their presence was a reminder that the monarchy would continue even as it adapted to the loss of one of its most beloved members. Harry looked out the car window at the people still gathered along the route, many of whom would probably remain there for hours more, reluctant to let go of this connection to Diana's memory. He thought about how his mother would have been amazed and probably a little overwhelmed by the outpouring of love from so many strangers. She had always been surprised by the depth of public affection for her, never quite believing that she deserved such devotion. The journey to the Spencer family estate for the private burial would give the royal family time to process what they had just experienced. The public ceremony at Westminster Abbey had been necessary and meaningful, but it had also been performed under the intense scrutiny of millions of watching eyes. Now they would have the opportunity to say their personal goodbyes in a more intimate setting, surrounded only by close family and friends. As London passed by outside their windows, both William and Harry began to understand that this day marked not just an ending, but also a beginning. They would carry forward their mother's commitment to helping others, but they would do it in their own way and on their own terms. The challenges she had faced with media attention and public expectations had taught them valuable lessons about the importance of maintaining boundaries while still serving the public. Good. The royal guards accompanying them represented more than just security. They embodied the institutional support that would help the princes navigate their future roles. These men had served the royal family through times of celebration and crisis, and their continued presence was a promise that William and Harry would not have to face their responsibilities alone. The flowers that had filled Westminster Abbey would eventually fade, and the crowds would disperse, but the impact of Diana's life and the ceremony honoring it would continue to influence British society for generations to come. Her sons had witnessed firsthand the power of compassion and service, lessons that would shape their own approaches to royal duty as they grew into their adult roles. The car carrying the princes moved through the London streets that Diana had traveled, countless times during her years as a working royal. Every route held memories of hospital visits, charity events, and public appearances, where she had connected with people in ways that broke down traditional barriers between royalty and citizens. Her legacy lived on not just in the formal charitable organizations she had supported, but in the countless individual acts of kindness she had inspired. As they prepared to leave London behind for the more private ceremony ahead, William and Harry carried with them the knowledge that they had been part of something truly historic. The public response to their mother's death and funeral had shown them the potential for the monarchy to serve as a force for unity and healing in times of national grief. It was a responsibility they would need to grow into, but one they had seen modeled by their mother's example. The royal guards would continue their vigil, adapting their protection to meet the changing needs of the royal family as William and Harry matured into their roles. The traditions represented by their red uniforms and ceremonial duties would provide continuity, while allowing for the evolution and modernization that Diana had begun during her own royal service. Years later, both princes would look back on this day as a turning point in their understanding of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. The lessons learned in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by the love and support of a grieving nation, would guide them as they worked to honor their mother's memory, while forging their own paths in service to others. The day that had begun with such sorrow would ultimately become the foundation for a renewed sense of purpose and commitment to the values Diana had held most dear. The procession continued toward its final destination, carrying with it the hopes and prayers of millions of people who would never forget the woman they had come to honor. The royal guards maintained their formation as the cars moved through the countryside, their dedication unwavering even as the public portion of their duties came to an end. In the weeks and months that would follow, the impact of this day would continue to unfold. The charities Diana had supported would see increased donations and volunteer participation from people inspired by the ceremony they had witnessed. The causes she had championed, from landmine removal to AIDS research to homelessness prevention, would benefit from renewed public attention and support. William and Harry would return to their studies, but they would do so with a deeper understanding of their future responsibilities and the example their mother had set for them. The royal guards who had protected them through this most difficult day would continue to serve, adapting their methods and approaches to meet the changing needs of a royal family that had been forever changed by loss but also strengthened by the love they had witnessed. So, ancient stones of Westminster Abbey would continue to stand, having added another chapter to their long history of serving as the setting for moments of national significance. The echoes of the day's music and words would fade, but the memory of what had taken place within those sacred walls would endure, becoming part of the building's eternal story of service to the crown and the people of Britain. As the sun began to set on this most extraordinary day, the legacy of love, service, and compassion that Diana had embodied continued to live on in the hearts of all who had been touched by her life and inspired by her example. The Royal Guard stood ready to protect and serve a new generation of royals who would carry that legacy forward into an uncertain but hopeful future.